Bien, amigas y amigos, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon session of the Rafael del Pino Foundation's Master Lecture Program. My sincere thanks to all of you for your presence today. We know that in Madrid, as soon as it begins to rain, everybody stays home, nobody leaves. So those of you who've arrived here, thank you, congratulations, thank you for being with us. And also for being with us in the auditorium proper, sharing this very interesting time. And we also would like to say thank you to those who are following us on the Foundation's digital platform and our social media accounts. All of you are very cordially welcome. Our business and geopolitical environment is enormously complex. I think that we all agree with this statement. Fragile supply chains, regulatory tensions, political polarization, and an international system which is subject to pressure and readjustment. And remember also accelerated changes in the ways we communicate and relate to each other, fostered by digital negotiation and new communication modes. In this context, negotiating is more than a mere exchange of compromises. It is more than reaching one-off agreements. It is increasingly being able to lead in uncertain, complex, and dynamic scenarios in which every decision has all manner of implications. And we are very lucky because we're going to be able to understand a little bit better how to negotiate, because we have with us Professor Max Bazerman to address the issue today. Negotiation, the game has changed, is the name of the title. And we're privileged to have with us Professor Bazerman, who is Jesse Isidor Straus Professor of Business Administration at Harvard's Business School and one of the world's paramount experts in leadership, decision-making, and business ethics. Throughout his career, Professor Bazerman has studied why even smart, well-meaning people make predictable mistakes when taking decisions and how to avoid making them. In so doing, he helps leaders and organizations anticipate risks, recognize biases, and act with greater clarity and integrity. His work has profoundly influenced the way we understand negotiation, ethical blind spots, and managerial responsibility. His latest book, Negotiation, The Game Has Changed, published by Deusto, is based on the central idea that while the traditional rules of negotiation still matter, the context has been radically transformed. Culture, economy, politics, relationships, communication channels, and behavior of counterparts today make for much more complex scenarios, forcing us to rethink our negotiation and conflict resolution strategies. Professor Bazerman delves into operational issues by analyzing aspects such as the use of extreme positions or anchors in negotiations, the use of these initial anchors, the risks of being extreme in negotiations. This is something that we see frequently nowadays. He wonders about intuitive reactions, sharing the difference, and underscores the importance of expanding the pie before dividing it. So, ethical negotiation in competitive environments. This is an essential book. It is closely linked with the ethical aspects, even in very complex settings, how to deal with conflicts when different parties have to maintain the relationship over time, and how to adapt our strategies to a changing world which is changing the way that we negotiate. So in short, Max Bazerman invites us to understand that negotiating well today requires leadership, strategic preparation, and ethical awareness. I would like to express our gratitude to Deusto for its collaboration in the organization of this event, and I would like especially to congratulate Roger Domingo, the editorial director, for continuing to promote a line of publications that contribute decisively to elevating the business and management debate in our country. It is wonderful to have Professor Bazerman with us, with his lovely wife, who is with us also. And we're going to enjoy, as I say, a very interesting, I'm sure, keynote speech. And after the speech, we will hear and participate in the dialogue with Professor Enrique Peña, an engineer and specialist in negotiation and business strategy, Deputy Director of the Center for Negotiation and Mediation at IE Business School, and no less important, at least for us, Rafael del Pino Fellow of Excellence. With a strong academic and professional background in the strategic sectors, his experience will bring a practical and complementary perspective to Professor Bazerman's reflections. I don't want to take up more of your time. I would remind you, however, to kindly use the QR code provided at the entrance to pose your questions. And Professor Peña will make sure that Professor Bazerman receives those questions. Professor Bazerman additionally will be available if you want for him to sign a book, etc. So without further ado, I invite you to join us in this reflection on how to effectively and responsibly both lead and negotiate in a world that has changed. I'm very happy to give the floor to Professor Max Bazerman. Thank you, sir, for joining us at the Rafael del Pino Foundation.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the Rafael del Pino Foundation for bringing me to Madrid. It's my privilege to be here. I thank all the people who helped organize and the leaders who shared with me their wisdom earlier in the day. I learned a lot about what's on the minds of Spanish leaders, and I think that will be helpful as we continue our dialogue this evening. Now, the book that I wrote, Negotiation, the Game Has Changed, was published in 2025. And for those of you who are familiar with the publishing industry, that means that I finished writing it in 2024. So it was off to press and out of my hands by 2024. As I talk about context, which is going to be a big part of the story, I'll bring up some of the things that I heard on the minds of leaders, many of whom are in the audience today, some of the things that are on their mind that I may not have captured in the book, but is certainly appropriate for us to talk about this evening. I've been teaching negotiations for a very long time, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful topic to teach. I grew up as a game player, so for me, when I teach negotiations, I'm kind of orchestrating a game, so that part is kind of fun for me. The other thing, and I know we have some negotiation teachers in the room, and I don't mean to insult their skills at all, but one of the secrets that my colleagues don't always like me to share is teaching negotiations is among the easiest things to teach imaginable. People love to learn about negotiation. So I also teach on the topic of decision making, or what's often now called behavioral economics, or what are the cognitive mistakes that people make. Nobody likes learning about the mistakes that they make. But people are delighted to learn that their negotiation skills aren't perfect. In fact, most people are comfortable with the idea that they're not great negotiators, and they would be delighted to learn how to negotiate more effectively. And one of the things that happens to not just me, but to lots of negotiation professors, is toward the end of the class, a student will come up to me, and they'll start off with a compliment, but sometimes when you're getting a compliment, you know the word "but" is coming after a comma. And I have lots of conversations that feel like that. They tell me something nice about my class, and then a but's coming, and what follows the but, and there's a lot of examples that are up on the chart that I won't read to you, but they tell you something specific about their lives, okay? About the country that they live in, the culture of the people that they negotiate against, the nature of structural changes in the economy, and they say, but can you help me negotiate with my spouse? Okay, and they want to treat that as a different context. And the question is formulated like, and I'm not sure your course dealt with that. And I generally think our course did deal with that. That is, I think that it's good to create value in negotiations with your business partner. I think it's good to create value in a strategic alliance. I think it's good to create value when you're negotiating with your spouse. So a lot of the core concepts that we teach, whether it's think about your alternative, think about your reservation price, think about their side in the negotiation, think about where there are trades from, where there are gains from trade that can create value. I think that these are very robust concepts that are relevant across all the buts. But the buts tell us about how we need to contextualize to that specific context. And I can tell you from my morning discussion with some of the foundation leaders, on top of the mind, and I'll generalize from the foundation leaders to this audience, two contextual topics that are on everybody's mind is how do we negotiate when Donald Trump is the president of the United States? So that's a contextual issue that matters. And so it's not going to be in my slides because, as I said, my book was written in 2024, but I think it will become part of our discussion later on. And the other contextual topic that is on our minds these days is negotiating in the context of AI in a variety of ways. So again, I think we can come back to those topics. So the fact that there's little about Donald Trump or artificial intelligence in my book doesn't mean that it's off limits in any way at all. So I've written a couple of books on negotiation. In 1992, I wrote a book called Negotiating Rationally with Margaret Neal. In 2007, I wrote a book called Negotiation Genius with Deepak Malhotra. And I'm not willing to admit that anything is wrong in those books. So that's not what the current book is about. It's not a statement that there's something fundamentally wrong with the prior work, but rather we can think more systematically about how context affects these ideas and how to help our MBA students, our executive students, adapt the concepts to their particular context. And there have been some big changes. So 9/11 had a dramatic effect on changing the perception and the power of the United States. The Great Recession suggested that we needed to think about the housing market in some fundamentally different ways. Over the last 20 plus years, many of our societies have become increasingly bifurcated and polarized in ways that affect negotiation. The online economy is a fundamental shift. Before we even get to AI, the fact that at the beginning of COVID, many of us woke up to the fact that the way we typically do our business tasks, we weren't going to continue doing, that we were going to need to shift to doing those same tasks on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever your preferred platform might look like. And each of these changes has had profound implications. If we think about negotiating online, by the way, I was sort of 1 week in March, I was teaching MBA students in person at the Harvard Business School, and when I got an email informing me that next week you'll be teaching online. And I assumed that I was old enough that I would get to die without ever teaching online, that in person would be my basic format of teaching, but all of a sudden I'm online. And that takes a lot of new preparation to think about the nature of the interaction. If you're negotiating and you have a team of negotiators, but you're not all in the same place, I think you need to do more coordination in advance about who's going to say what and when are they going to say it, rather than having one negotiation partner surprise their partner by what comes out of their mouth, which the other side, in fact, hears. Okay, so we could go on and on about how some of these jolts affect things. But some of the core ideas hold, as I was saying at the very beginning. Knowing that we have a term from Roger Fisher and Bill Urey's book, Getting to Yes, called a best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or a BATNA. It's still good advice to know your best alternative to a negotiated agreement before you show up for the negotiation. It's good to think about the other side's alternative. What are they going to do if they don't reach an agreement with you? It's good to think about the zone of possible agreement. It's good to break up what I see in many executives, and that is they have a mythical fixed pie. What's good for me is bad for you, and many people have accused the president of the country that I come from of being guilty of exactly that he views the world with a mythical fixed pie. And one of the things we can do when we teach is we can break that assumption. We know a lot about how to help negotiators create value, and it's still relevant today. We know a lot about the systematic biases of negotiators, and we know a lot about how to think about what biases that we can anticipate from the other side. But there are some phenomena that we've been talking about in negotiations for decades, but I think we know a little bit more about them. So that print may get a little bit small, and I'm not going to stop to read, but I'm going to tell you about what's up here. There are both many research articles and many executives who argue you should start with relatively extreme anchors. Okay, because when you make concessions, you'll still end up at a better point. So if you're a seller, start with a very high price. Okay? And there's research evidence suggesting that that works. But I think it works because in a lot of our experiments, in a lot of our classroom demonstrations, when you make an extreme offer to the other side, they rarely pick up their bags and go home. But when you try to sell your company for 3 times what it's worth, nobody shows up. Okay? You ending up with no deal at a shockingly high rate. So I don't mind anchoring high within the range of reasonableness, but I think that following the advice to anchor extreme is not of particularly good value. And when you're trying to sell your company and you start at 50 million and you come down to 40 million, you come down to 30 million, you come down to 20 million, the other side has no reason to assume that you're done moving. So one of the problems with starting extreme is when you move, you convey to the other side, just keep on waiting, I keep on moving, and they don't have a good sense that you have any reality about what your company is also worth. Another interesting topic where we see conflicting advice is the topic of 50-50 splits. So we have all been in negotiations where the other side has said, we're only $600 off, why don't we split the difference 300-300? And somehow that seems fair. Even to people in a capitalist economy, this more communistic idea of dividing things equally somehow sounds fair. And there's a book, popular book by Chris Voss called Never Split the Difference. There isn't actually that much in the book suggesting you should never split the difference. So it may simply be a problem I have with the title. But it seems to me to never split the difference is just a really bad conclusion. So my spouse Marla's in the front row, and sometimes there's 2 dog walks left in the day. And to say I'll do one and you can do one, that seems like an okay way to resolve a lot of decisions. Or it could be an important decision. It could be an inheritance decision between you and a sibling, and dividing things 50-50 may be a perfectly reasonable way to keep the family happy in some sense. And Voss argues to never split the difference, and he gives an example of, I want to wear a pair of black shoes, my wife wants me to wear a pair of brown shoes, so I shouldn't wear one black and one brown, and that's his evidence to not split the difference. Well, I'd say that that's good evidence in that example. Splitting the difference doesn't make sense, but in other examples it does. Barry Nailbuff, in a book called Split the Pie, gives a much more intriguing argument to say, why don't we just figure out how much incremental value we're creating in negotiation and then split the pie? And he almost in religious-like form argues we should always do that. If I had to pick between the two, I like nail buff over Voss. Okay? But on the other hand, when I go buy a car from a car dealer, I'm not all that concerned about the long-term relationship. And if I can do better than splitting the pie, I'm perfectly happy to do so. My former colleague, former because he's passed away, David Messick, argues that splitting the difference, in fact, is a social heuristic. Heuristic in the social sciences means rule of thumb, and we commonly think of cognitive rules of thumb that we use. And he argues that we split things 50-50 not because it's fair, but rather it's a nice rule of thumb so we don't even have to talk about what's fair. Okay? So that you don't have to talk with your sibling about who should get how much of the inheritance. It's just a rule of thumb to make things socially easier. Or when you go out to dinner with another couple, rather than arguing, you ate more than I did, each couple may put one credit card on the table and say, just split the bill. It's not because we ate the same amount. It's we don't want to talk about who ate what. And a 50-50 split solves this problem kind of very, very nicely. Okay. One of the things that I think is fascinating is the topic of ethics, which is another research interest of mine in the context of negotiation. There's a lot in the book about ethics, but I want to provide one interesting story. And all my stories I hear in life. I get lots of stories by being a negotiation professor. And in this story, there's a couple that's been searching for a home, and they're using a friend of theirs as a real estate agent. And the problem is they think that the real estate agent is giving them advice that's good for the real estate agent, but not good for them. And they say, so should I trust this agent? In fact, given that they're giving me advice that isn't in my best interest, should I even be friends with them? Okay? And my reaction to that is that in negotiations, it's important to understand that lots of people provide self-serving advice. Okay? Not because they mean to abuse you in any way, but because we tend to see the world the way we would like it to be. So the real estate agent would like to close a deal quickly, and they see it in your best interest to act in a way that would be consistent with their own material interests. So good people often give us advice that's self-serving for them without being bad people, but it still is biased advice. So we need to understand that a lot of unethical behavior, whether it's sexism or racism, happens without people having intentionality. And a lot of things that happen in negotiation, people may engage in behaviors that you might not find perfectly ethical, but they had no bad intent to begin with. So I think it's important to have some perspective to that. Okay. So I want to share with you kind of a true story. And it comes under the topic of changing the game. So the English title of the book is Negotiations, the Game Has Changed. And much of the book is about how to think about how the game has changed and also how you can change the game in a variety of ways. I had a friend who listed a condo in Cambridge, Massachusetts on the real estate market at a time that the market was a hot market. And she thought that the house was worth a little bit more than $1 million, but her real estate agent convinced her to put it on the market for $989,000. And the agent in this case argued that what we want to do in a hot market is get lots of buyers interested and create a bidding war on the house. And the way this often occurs is that the house will be advertised during kind of midweek, but there will be an announcement that there will be open houses either on Saturday and Sunday or sometimes just Sunday, and then publicly state, and we'll consider offers next Tuesday or Wednesday. Okay? And the idea is to let lots of people come through the house, get multiple people want to make offers, and make sure that we get the offers at the same time to help create this bidding war. That's the proposal of the agent. My friend basically agrees to this plan, and then someone tries to change the game on her in an intriguing kind of way. And on Friday evening, they get an offer that's going to expire on Sunday before the deadline that's been announced to lots of other people. But the offer is for $1.125 million, more than she thought she was going to get for the condo to begin with. And I get an email from her asking for advice, and she includes this piece of an email from her real estate agent who was the one who had proposed this idea of getting simultaneous offers next Tuesday. But now all of a sudden, with an offer in front, he argues you should either take it or counter with just a little bit more and close the deal. And basically say, these are your buyers. So I have a friend, his name's Guhan Subramanian. He's also a professor at the Harvard Business School. He does a lot of work in the merger context. And in the merger context, there's an idea that's called go shop. And if you imagine company A is offering to acquire company B, and B doesn't know what the market is. So it doesn't want to take the offer without learning what the market is, but A says, I'm not going to hold my offer open forever. So do you go with A, or do you go with the offer you have, or do you go out into the market to see if there's other buyers? And the idea of a go shop is an agreement between the first buyer who shows up and the seller that basically says, I hear your offer. If I can't do better, your offer's okay. But I want a period of time to go shop. And what I'll give you in order to give me the time to go shop is I'll give you the opportunity to beat the offer that I get. So the seller is giving the buyer an opportunity to know that they can close the deal, but they might have to pay whatever the market price would actually look like. And I said, so why don't you go back to this very eager buyer and tell them you'll take the offer if you can't do better, but if they let you have the offer open until early next week, then what you'll give them in return is the opportunity to slightly beat the best offer you can find. And that's what she did. And the result, was after a couple rounds of bids, she had an offer for $1.2 million, and the original buyers said, we'll pay $1.21, and she was able to lock in the deal. So rather than thinking about, do I take the $1.125 or do I say no, because she was somewhat nervous that the offer could fall apart, and that was certainly possible, Go Shop provided a different opportunity. Okay, now I want to talk about one other interesting way to change the game, and Danny Kahneman and I call it the final offer arbitration challenge. And the way the final offer arbitration challenge works really comes from 1960s work in labor relations, but also from American baseball, and I'll explain that in a minute. So back in the 1960s, in the labor management field, when labor and management went to an arbitrator, arbitrators were accused of not being wise judges, but rather people who tended to split the difference between the two parties, so nobody was very mad. Both sides were only slightly mad. And the problem with this image of an arbitrator is that it could mean that both parties could try to be more extreme, so when the arbitrator split the difference, that would work to their advantage. And as a result, facing arbitration, people might be more prone to remaining extreme, less prone to making reasonable concessions to get a deal done. And this guy, Carl Stevens, comes along and he says, I have a better way to do arbitration. In my revised system called final offer arbitration, the way it works is labor provides a wage, management provides a wage, and the arbitrator has to take one or the other, not a point in between. And some people would say, well, why would you force the arbitrator to one unreasonable price rather than another? And the quick answer is the beauty of final offer arbitration is that both parties get nervous that they're being too unreasonable, and that brings them to the negotiation table. So in the American sport of baseball, and you don't have to appreciate anything about baseball for this story, and final offer arbitration is often called baseball arbitration. In Major League Baseball, when a player and a team can't agree on a price, but they agree that they want to stay together, so they agree that the player will work for the team next year, but there's a dispute about price, they use final offer arbitration. The player names a price, the team names a price, and the arbitrator decides which one's fair. And the amazing part about this is every January, about 100 players file for final offer arbitration, and about 3 actually get arbitrated. Rather, what happens is that the fear of losing to the other side makes the parties more reasonable so that the arbitration process never, ever gets implemented. So this is a system that seems to work very effectively, despite the fact that it's a bit counterintuitive. What Kahneman and I argued in a Harvard Business Review paper, and it's also in the book, is that when you're negotiating with somebody, you can imagine you're an insurance company, and you have a claimant who's asking for a completely ridiculous amount of money. And you want to get them to come to the table. And you have a claim, let's say it's worth $1 million. We can go with yours, €1 million. You've offered them $800,000 to settle, and they want $10 million. And you're confident that any reasonable person would see it as worth roughly $1 million, might be $800,000, might be $1.3 million. The idea of final offer arbitration is proposed to them rather than spend 3 years going through the court system, which it could take in the United States. Why don't we go to an arbitrator next month? We'll both go with a number and an envelope and give the arbitrator the assignment of picking the one that's fair. And when insurance companies implement this kind of process, what happens is that the other side often says, I don't want to go through that process, but they realize that their bluff has been called, and they show up at the negotiation table with a much more reasonable negotiation stance. Because if their $10 million number had been reasonable, they should love this idea of final offer arbitration against this completely unreasonable insurance company. But this highlights, I believe my number, do you? And negotiation processes can begin. So there are a variety of ways that we can think about changing the game. And there are also times where it just doesn't make sense to negotiate. When you're negotiating would recognize an unreasonable anchor, it may not make sense to negotiate. When your actions would accept the illegal or unethical behavior of the other side, it may not make sense to negotiate. When negotiating would reduce your own integrity, you might not want to negotiate. So these are some of the times in which I don't see as negotiation as the answer to all problems. There are times when we want to make a decision that we want to deal with a dispute in some very, very different way. Okay, with that, I believe Professor Peña is going to join me, and we're going to continue the conversation, and then we'll bring all of you into the conversation as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bazerman. It was
Thank you.
an amazing learning experience for us. Also to have you in Madrid and in the foundation for the first time, it's a honor. It's a honor, and
Thank you.
And we are very welcoming people in general in Spain. So we hope that you come back very soon. And this is a place of freedom, similarly to the United States. Spain is a place of freedom. So what we did is we provided a QR to our audience to send whatever questions they have. And I have grouped them in several types of questions. Trump is in many of them.
I experienced that this morning as well. Yeah.
I also wanted to say that I liked a lot your conference. I said one part, you said that teaching negotiations was easy.
It is.
See, but I have some of my students are
Yeah,
here.
I'm sorry about that. But, yeah.
Don't tell the trick.
Yeah.
Well, it is definitely an exciting skill that the world needs. Mm-hmm. And if you want, we can start with the general context that we are experiencing. All what would you call in your book the context is changing, and that has an effect on the basics. Foundations that still prevail, but somehow they are modified by the context. So we see that we have a lot of challenges in the world, and here I take some of the audience questions regarding inequality, things like lack of resources or scarcity, interdependence of the different countries. All of that was solved in the past with reciprocity and creating sort of networks of countries, networks of people, connections. But it seems like these traditional methods of doing politics in a softer, probably power way, it's pivoting into more hard way of doing politics. What's going on? How can we explain this?
I think that there's lots of things in society that are making negotiations more focused on sort of beating the other side. So whether we think about Trump's tariff or trade policies, or we think about the bifurcation of the economy, the polarization of the economy, as soon as we think about divides, we think about power. And when we think about power, we think who gets how much. And we lose the idea of how do we create more value. I think of my executive students, and I teach lots of executive students who are very successful in life, and they show up for a negotiation course, and on day 2, we have a simulation where the key to success is making trade-offs across issues. For one party to win on the issue they care about, while the other side wins on the issue that they care more about, and they create more joint gain. And I run into lots of senior executives who have just had a mythical fixed pie in their mind all their life, and they sort of are stunned by the fact that there's good evidence that, in fact, that the size of the pie can be enhanced. And I think that a lot of the economic factors that are going on sort of play into this mythical fixed pie. So the economist Ricardo talked about the law of comparative advantage and argues that, you know, one of the bases of trade is that some countries can make some products or services more effectively and other countries can make other products and services more effectively. It doesn't make sense for all countries to make all the products that they need when we can do better by trading the stuff I can make well for the stuff that you can make well, and create more value for all of us. Free trade policies are very helpful for helping the world create value. And it used to be in the United States that the Republicans or right-leaning party sort of believed in free trade, and the Democrats or the left-leaning party trying to protect the unions who had specific jobs in the United States were more against trade. Today we see a very strange flip. So there are still traditional Republicans in the US who are enthusiasts for free trade, but Donald Trump, who's part of the Republican Party and is now at kind of the core of the Republican Party, is the least free trade president we've seen in contemporary history, and that's destroying lots of opportunities to create value by wise trade agreements.
So some other Trump's questions are regarding his negotiation skills.
Yeah.
Do you think that he's a good negotiator, or besides the intention, or I'm not going to get into politics of the measures, as a negotiator, do you think he's a good negotiator?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to answer you as a negotiation professor as opposed to somebody who did not vote for Donald Trump. So I can't claim to be unbiased, but then again, I don't think any of us can. But my goal isn't to make a political comment. It's to answer your question as clearly as possible. You know, we can pick the dimension to evaluate Trump's negotiation policy. So if you ask Trump, are you effective? He'd say, I'm enormously effective, and he would talk about the billions of dollars that have been raised by collecting tariffs on the imports of countries who have been abusing their relationship with the United States for years. So one measure, okay, tariffs collected by the US government, is way up, although there are now court challenges, but let's assume that the US keeps a good chunk of these tariffs. That's a measure that there's been some economic gain. The problem is that the cost to American consumers has gone up significantly. The goods simply cost more once you add the tariff. So it's not entirely clear whether Spanish olive oil, whether the producers in Spain are paying it or whether the consumers on the American end are paying it. So there's a kind of a loss there. The other loss is sort of just a destruction of the trade systems across countries, which Ricardo, a very long time ago, and I'm kind of endorsing, free trade is good for creating value in the world, and that's being missed. The other thing that the United States is going to need to reckon with is the nature of its relationships with people who used to be their close friends. I see in the newspaper in the last 48 hours that there seems to be some tension between Trump and Sanchez on a number of fronts. But we can look at physically closer relationships. So Canada I find to be a fascinating example. You know, Americans have historically loved Canadians. They're a lot like Americans, only nicer. So we have positive regard toward Canadians. Canadians aren't feeling really good about the U.S. Marla and I spent some time in Toronto, and when we go to the main liquor store is the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. And the truth is we do like Cabernets from Napa Valley in the U.S., but if you go to the Liquor Control Board of Ontario wine store, there are no American Cabernets. In fact, there's no American wine. There are simply signs making fun of America and guiding you to the wine that you can buy instead of buying American wines in the store. Okay? Well, there's something wrong with the relationship. But if you wanted a bigger signal that there's something wrong with the relationship, you know, if we go back to a long time ago to 2024, Canada and China did not get along particularly well. And now what Trump has done is he's improved Canadian-Chinese trade relationships by a significant degree. And even after Trump is gone, okay, at that time, Canada's going to have some new trading partners. And are we going to get our relationship back with Canada? I think the hostility will go away at some point, but I think that there will be some very long-term losses as a result of his strategy. So I think you need to pick the dimension. Is the U.S. collecting tariff money? Yes. Do I think it's a long-term wise strategy for the U.S.? Well, we're saying no, and it's an embarrassment to me as an American negotiation professor.
Thank you. Let's move into another block of questions regarding technology. You talked about the digital way of as a mean of negotiating the channel. But we have some questions regarding artificial intelligence. Here we have one, for instance, Alberto Blasco, in an era of artificial intelligence and data-driven decision-making, do you believe algorithms and AI tools will eventually play meaningful roles in negotiations or even substitute it? Or will human judgment and ultimate decisions still remain forever?
Yeah, so I think we know the answer to this one. Artificial intelligence is already playing a significant role. It's going to grow, and those of us who would like a more human-centric approach, well, we should get over it because the world's going to change whether we like it or not. So I'm 70 years old, and I have no plans of becoming an expert at artificial intelligence. On the other hand, I've spent my career being really good at surrounding myself with younger, smarter, more up-to-date scholars who can inform me about lots of dimensions. So my colleague Deepak Malhotra, who I wrote Negotiation Genius with, and a colleague named Amit Goldenberg, who is an artificial intelligence expert, they provide me with a lot of coaching that I need. So in my executive education offerings that I coordinate, and they're part of the teaching team that delivers the program, we're incorporating what they know about artificial intelligence. By next year, when I'm teaching MBAs in the 25, 26 academic year, I fully expect to sort of have borrowed their expertise to incorporate it to a significant degree. So I'll just give you some examples. I've done a lot of work in the insurance industry. I work with a company based in Ottawa, Canada, called Slice Insurance. Slice Insurance is all about moving the insurance business online, not just selling you a policy, but everything from selling you a policy to when you when you submit a claim for an AI bot to basically negotiate the resolution to the claim. And the argument for the bot is that it can incorporate data about what a claim is worth far faster than a human, can do it more accurately than a human. It can also detect fraud better than a human can. And with a bot handling your claim, if it's a simple, obviously legitimate claim, your money can be in your bank account in a matter of seconds rather than months if you're dealing with a human in a 22-story building who's reviewing it and checking with their boss. So there's a lot of things that we can that a bot can learn to do better. We can also identify the cases where we don't want to trust artificial intelligence for some reason and figure out how to incorporate humans. Humans are going to be necessary to figure out how to set up the bot. Okay? Humans are necessary for telling the bot, what are we trying to accomplish? Before you optimize it, I need to tell you what's important. So sort of, if your goal is to not pay claims, which some insurance companies have been accused of, you don't need an artificial intelligence agent to do it. You could just delay paying claims forever and ever and ever. But that's probably not a particularly wise strategy. If your goal is to keep customers extraordinarily happy, you can overpay claims maintain relationships, but you're paying too much out in claims. If you're trying to figure out what claims should be paid quickly and which ones need more attention, I think that now we're into a world where artificial agents can be shockingly helpful. My colleague Amit Goldenberg, who I mentioned a minute ago, he runs an activity in his negotiation class, which I'm working hard so they'll be sophisticated enough to teach this next year. But what he does is he has students negotiate a particular simulation between a buyer and a seller. And after they're done, so they kind of know what the story looks like, the next task is to have the students write an instruction to a bot, telling the bot what they're trying to accomplish in the negotiation. So basically, you can imagine turning the negotiation over to a bot. Now, what you tell the bot is going to be critically important in terms of what they do. So the bot gets to read the case, the bot gets the instruction of what their job is, and then Amit has all the bots play against each other in a round-robin competition. And he reports back to the students not so much who did well, but what are the characteristics of the instructions that are given to the bot that maximizes performance. Okay? So we can now see, again, the human isn't going away. The human is simply giving over the part of the task to the bot that the bot can do better. But the human has to specify, what are we trying to accomplish? What do I want you to emphasize? What's the goal that the bot should have? But with technology today, yes, bots can outperform human beings.
Great. Let's move to the third block, because negotiation is so rich. It touches psychological aspects, it touches ethical aspects, economical aspects, game theory and decision making that you have researched a lot, cognitive bias that we have also. I would like to open now a block on that. It has to do with philosophy, what is fair, what is not fair. So being a simple and easy probably discipline to teach because it's fun and people enjoy it a lot, the reality is one of the most complex abilities given how many dimensions, holistic dimensions it contains. And you have researched a lot on cognitive bias. You came to the understanding that we are our reasoning is not perfect, and we are fully loaded with a lot of bias. And I have several questions regarding this. For instance, Alfonso Calabia in the audience says, in your book, The Game Has Changed, which congratulations, because today is the first day it's published in Spanish. So
thank you.
So this is 400 million people that are going to be able now to read in their native language.
Even 10% would be good.
That would be good, right? So you highlight the role of cognitive bias in negotiation. You are probably the pioneer, together with Margaret Neal, back in the past when you were teaching at MIT. Which bias do you believe is currently the most dangerous in business and political negotiations?
Yeah, so some of you may know the work of Kahneman and Tversky, or Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And a lot of particularly my early work was in many ways bringing the idea that people are it's not just that people aren't perfect, it's that we're biased in systematic and predictable ways. And a lot of my work and a number of my colleagues really brought that idea to the topic of negotiation. And I think there's a long list, but you asked for one, so I'll give you two. Right. Okay. So to put this into context, if we have any medical doctors here, you're probably annoyed by people who ask you for medical advice when you run into them at a cocktail party. Well, my version of this is at a cocktail party, people basically want me to reduce my 40 years of work to the answer to that question. Okay. Okay. Now, but that which means I've had practice doing that, right? So, so I'm going to share with the whole audience my two answers. One, negotiators don't think enough about the decisions of other parties. Okay? Independent of whether you want to be a nicer human being or not. It'd be good to be a nicer human being. But independent of that, there's so much strategic information to be gained by thinking about the perspective of the other side, and we tend to not do that. Many of us have heard the phrase, put yourself in the shoes of others. It's a good idea. It's just that we don't tend to do it. We tend to approach negotiations from what we want rather than thinking, what do I need to understand about what they want in order to actually get a deal done? So spending lots more time thinking about the decisions of others is important. So I would call that bias a failure to think about the decisions of others. And then the other one, which we've touched on, is the mythical fixed pie of negotiation. Okay, some people say, so do you agree with the view that the pie is fixed or it's not fixed? And my answer is, it's a fact that there are many, many negotiations where the pie isn't fixed. If I'm going to sell you my car and you're going to give me money, then that's pretty fixed. The more money you pay me, the better off I am, the worse off you are. But as soon as we're in a normal business negotiation, even if it's as simple as you're hiring a student who's graduating from an MBA program, and you're going to offer them a salary, and you're going to offer them a bonus, and you're going to specify how many weeks of vacation a year they receive. You're going to provide them with a title. You're going to discuss who are they going to report to in the organization. You're going to discuss what projects they're going to work on early in their career. There's a whole bunch of things going on here. Well, it turns out that the employer and the student don't weight these topics equally. Some things are more important to one side in the negotiation, and realizing that the pie isn't fixed, and realizing that we make widgets better and you make idiots better and we can trade, okay, that's where value comes from. And when we have a mythical fixed pie, we lose the opportunity to create value. So my answers were failure to think about the decisions of others and assuming a mythical fixed pie.
Thank you for the straightforward answers. And we will have at the end of the discussion, I would like to go through some suggestions, last-minute suggestions. So I tell you just to book some 3 or 4 final suggestions for the audience to negotiate tomorrow. But before we go into that, I'd like to open the chapter on culture. Negotiation teaching has been predominantly grounded in the Anglo-Saxon world. Postgraduate studies in the United States, the industrialization was primarily happening in the Anglo-Saxon world, but now we have some questions regarding the pivoting into other superpowers like China, which have a different way of doing business and different cultural values and attributes. So Estelio Sousa is asking, how do you think the rapid growth of China as a global superpower is impacting negotiations as a way of doing business nowadays?
Yeah. So there are undoubtedly cultural differences. There's different styles. There's things that we want to understand about people's behavior. We want to understand sort of New York bluntness doesn't mean that they don't like you. Okay, it's a style of behavior. We want to be aware of that. We also want to realize that, so in the US, I think we have about 300 million people. Americans are kind of aware that not all 300 million of them are the same, that there are differences. Psychologists talk about in-group heterogeneity, in-group variance, out-group homogeneity. We treat people from other groups as if they are the same. So we assume a stereotype about them. And And lots of people can tell you stories about what they ran into in those countries. I'm not doubting their experience. But what I will predict is that when you assume that all Italians are the same, if you talk to Italians, they will tell you, no, Italians vary to a significant degree. So to begin with, I would say that you want to learn about culture if you're negotiating in a different culture. Okay? On the other hand, you don't want to assume that you're negotiating with a stereotype from that culture. You want to use the early parts of a negotiation to learn about the specific person, the specific company with whom you're negotiating. And I think that that's how we want to use any demographic information. We don't want to ignore it, but we don't want to assume that it's a perfect description either. Now, the question mentioned China. And I'm old enough that the country has changed. Mm-hmm. So many of you will remember, if we go back to the 1980s, the question wasn't China, it was Japan. Mm-hmm. So Japan had a booming economy, they were picking up market share, and everyone wanted to know, how do you negotiate with the Japanese? And there was definitely this aura that they're fundamentally different. And I would say, turns out that people in Japan vary. There's cultural differences, there's norms of politeness, there's norms of formality that are all different. We want to understand that. But what people were really referring to is Japan had power in the 1980s, and they could drive a harder bargain. Today, China is in a kind of a phenomenal position. They've been through kind of phenomenal growth, and all of a sudden, there's a bunch of people who want to increase their trading with them because of reasons that we've already talked about this evening. So we want to understand the actual context. Is it a style of behavior? To some degree, but it's also that China has economic power that they didn't have before. They have more economic power in 2025 than they did in 2024 because a lot of countries like Canada are knocking on their door saying, we'd like to talk to you.
And narrow to culture, I would like to talk about gender-specific issues. You told me before, when we were before coming, that your best students are women, and we come from a probably male-dominant way of doing business, which is changing and pivoting, thankfully, into a much more rich. How do you approach negotiation? And your wife is in front of us, how do you really perceive gender-specific differences? And how do you, in your teachings and your classes, how do you approach this topic?
Sure. So let me give you some kind of statistical facts. And you already mentioned a lot of our research comes out of an American context. So I'm going to be guilty on this, but I'm going to bet that this is true in Spain as well.
That's true.
But I can't show you the data. So in an American context, I'll give you two empirical results. Women are more cooperative than men. Men are more competitive than women. Okay? If we think about this in terms of being good at creating value, women are better at creating value than men. If we think about claiming value, men are better than women at claiming value. So easy to identify empirical research that supports what I just said. A problem, and I don't mean to insult any journalists here, but the problem is that when we read a newspaper article that has 600 words, we often get the image, there's a title, Women Are from Venus and Men Are from Mars, or something like that. I forget the exact title. But we get the impression that we're talking about two different species in terms of how they negotiate. If you go back to the studies that the data came from, what you typically see are two overlapping distributions. Is there a mean difference on cooperativeness? Yes, there is. But you wouldn't want to take one male and one female and predict which one's going to definitively do better based on having the gender information alone, because those individuals are coming out of draws of the distribution. And so it's important to understand the variation in the two groups rather than just focus on that relatively small mean difference. So it's a little bit like the culture across in a different country. It's fine to know this fact. It's a mistake to assume because I'm negotiating with a female, this is what I'm going to expect and develop my negotiation strategy accordingly, when in fact I could first talk to them and find out who they are, what do they know, what their interests are, and then adapt my strategy more effectively.
So two more blocks, and we have to unfortunately finish in about 10 minutes. So the next block, I would like to, if you don't mind, I have a lot of questions about ethics.
Sure.
And then the last block, as I said, let's go more into the general learnings that you can share with us, so that we become better negotiators.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with the ethics. Here we have a question from Mr. Miguel Perez. Could you elaborate a bit about negotiations when parties have both a variety of representatives with interests that are different among them in their internal teams and not necessarily match 100%? How do we ethical balance the personal interest versus the group interest when we are in a team?
Yeah. So first of all, for your team, I would say the time to do that is not in the middle of the negotiation. Before you show up, it's time to get your act together and to coordinate what the team is doing. And sometimes the team's going to implement a strategy that you don't agree with. But I would argue it's typically better for the team to have an agreement on what our strategy looks like. And I would also say, who's going to do what when in the negotiation, particularly if you're online and you're in different locations, so you can't take 5 minutes to go talk in the hallway. Okay. And so you want to develop your strategies as clearly as possible. In terms of the other side, there's something that we've read about in a number of books called the good guy, bad guy routine. And in the United States, we most commonly hear this used to describe a car dealership. So you go in to buy a car, and this very friendly person meets you and says, I'm really on your side, I just want to get a deal done. And then the problem is the bad guy in the back, okay? And my quick advice on dealing with a group of mixed people is realize that you're almost always negotiating with the bad guy, okay? And the good guy might not even be a good guy, okay? The good guy's job might be to extract information out of you to tell the bad guy. So a lot of us want to deal with the good guy because the good guy's nicer. And by the way, no sexism implied with good guy. You could change your gender there. So a lot of us want to go to the person who's more comfortable, but we want to realize that this can be part of the game. The last thing I would say is some of us think it's good for the other side to be confused and for them to have this diversity. I think having confusion, honest confusion on the other side just makes negotiations very, very difficult because they're not able to get to the ability to say yes because of their honest confusion, their honest differences of opinion about their ethical approaches or strategic approaches. It just makes it more difficult, not just for them, but for you as well.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the polarized world. There is no right or wrong, it's good or bad. And that is probably, we need to change that game and change it into a much more value-creating game. The last question about ethics has to do with inequality of powers. What happens when, this is Diana Perez Arencha de Rea, how do you convince or how do you put ethics into an equation in which a party has much more power, or there is a clear imbalance of power. Does that powerful party need to give away some sort of a strength, or they have the right to squeeze all the zone of possible agreement for them?
Well, I didn't really like putting that word "squeeze" in there. I think that people who have developed a legitimate source of power, okay, are certainly entitled to use that power in negotiation. So if you're competing, let's assume you're competing for what's become rarer talent, people who, let's say, have artificial intelligence expertise, okay? If they're in rare supply and you find the best of the best and they want lots of money, well, I don't think you should be surprised by that. They have a lot of power. Where does their power come from? Their power comes from the fact that there's other companies other than your company that's happy to hire them. And to assume that they're going to take a more average salary, it's probably not realistic, and it probably doesn't help you. So I don't think that we should be thinking about eliminating power. I think we should think about whether people are appropriately using their power, or are they abusing power. So I'm not recommending giving in to bullies, and I think I've already implied that in other ways in this discussion. But I also don't think that we should conflate having power with doing something wrong. There are many people who have power; they've earned it to some degree, and they may appropriately be using it.
So finally, we have a lot of general questions about negotiations. I encourage you, if we didn't have time to address your question, Professor Bazerman is going to be afterwards signing the books, and you can definitely approach to you and ask straight to the point some questions. But in general, Professor, your wife was telling us some secrets about your personal life. You're a very generous person that contributes to the community in unprivileged students and privileged parts of the community where you live, and you teach them and you take care of them. So with your generosity, could you please share 2 or 3 learnings from your experience, or even the last book, that can help us navigate through life after tomorrow?
Yeah, so I referred to some of my colleagues earlier in the talk. I think that one of the things that we can easily do is to give other people credit when they deserve it. And I find that the cost of giving other people credit is approximately 0. Like, people like you better, not worse, when you give credit to other people. So I think that's kind of that's a way to grow the pie. You get to give someone else some credit, and no one takes any credit away from you for doing that. I think that having a mentality in life of how do I create more value. I mean, we've talked about in negotiation, by making trades across issues, we can create value. But by thinking about how can I create the most value I can with whatever resources I'm going to provide to society, to your teaching mission. So as a professor, what set of tasks create the most value for the world? I think that's a pretty good way of going through life, and I think it makes life more enjoyable.
And it's not a zero-sum game. Not
Exactly.
because you give credit or power to others, you lose credit of power. Sometimes you even gain, right?
Yeah.
So, Professor Bazerman, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor for the Foundation, for us to have you here. The good thing is that this has been recorded. So all your messages, and especially this last message, will be shared for the future with people that are passionate about negotiations like ourselves. So thank you very much. You're always welcome to come back together with your partner, of course. Very welcome to the Foundation, and very welcome to Madrid. So thank you very much. Let's give you a big clap.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.